Good day, all. This talk will explain how subjectivism works by focusing on key issues in this tradition. Specifically, I'm going to focus on three issues ranged on three levels of scale. On the micro scale, we're going to look at how individual subjectivity arises, or how the individual develops a mind and a sense of self. On the meso or medium scale, we're going to look at how intersubjectivity works, or how people interact. And on the macro scale, we're going to look at how meaning is established in culture through rationality, and how rationality has changed over time. So first we shall look at individual subjectivity, or the mind. To understand the human mind, we need to begin with a brief look at the nature-nurture debate. The question in this debate is whether human thought and behavior are more determined by nature or biology, or by nurture or society. At one extreme, there are biological determinists who argue that we're just biological robots programmed by our genetic makeup. They say biology is destiny. At the other extreme, there are social determinists who argue that society programs us to act a certain way from birth through the process of socialization. Neither of these extreme views allows much room for free will. However, most theorists these days would disagree with both of these views and argue instead that the nature-nurture debate has ended in a draw. Human beings are products of both nature, or biology, and nurture, or society. To be objectively human, we obviously have to be born biologically human. But to be subjectively human, we also have to be taught how to be human by other humans in society. We have to be taught to think in a human fashion, using words and reason, or else our intellectual development is stunted and we don't develop a human sense of self. The individual mind cannot develop in a social vacuum. Individual subjectivity can only develop in the context of intersubjectivity. The individual needs to communicate and interact with other people to become a person in their own right. This can be seen in the case of feral children. These are children who've been abandoned or neglected and who simply have not been taught how to be human. Although such cases are rare, they are persistent. For example, Victor was a boy found in 19th century France who'd been abandoned in the woods and raised by wolves. When he was captured, he thought of himself as a wolf. He went around naked on all fours, he couldn't speak, he howled at the moon, and so on. More recently, just in the 1990s, a girl named Oksana was found in Ukraine who had apparently been raised as part of a dog pack and who thought of herself as a dog. Even more tragic, perhaps, are cases of complete social isolation, where the child is just shut up in a room, given just enough food to survive, but otherwise completely ignored. This happened distressingly often in the 19th and early 20th centuries because of the terrible social disapproval that was associated with having an illegitimate child or a child born out of wedlock. These days, very few people care about this anymore, but back then it was a terrible source of shame. So, sometimes people would have the child in secret and then shut him or her up in a room and pretend they didn't exist. There have been several well-known cases of this in the US, such as Anna found in 1938, and genie, found in 1970. When they were found, none of these children could speak because they'd never been taught to speak. After they were found, they were taught to speak, but although all of them learned to speak up to a point, none of them ever learned to speak properly. They could learn the labels of individual things or actions, but they could never master grammar. In other words, how these things fit together. They could reach the linguistic level of a small child, but no further. In recent years, brain scans have shown why this is. In feral children, the speech center of the brain has physically shrunk or atrophied from disuse. As the saying goes, use it or lose it. The brain is a muscle like any other. If you don't use it, it wastes away. And once it's gone, it's gone. You can't get it back. The human body has specific needs, such as food and water, and specific abilities, such as the ability to walk or hold things in our hands. We use our abilities to satisfy our needs. However, it's more correct to say that we're born with the potential for certain abilities. Society then has to bring out that potential by teaching each individual how to use their abilities. If society does not bring out that potential, then eventually it dies. This is why we need both human biology and human society to become fully human. In particular, biology gives us the potential to speak, but society still has to teach us how to speak and has to give us the opportunity to speak, or we lose that ability. Objective potential must be matched by subjective learning to make a person fully human. Biology gives us the potential to be human, but society still has to teach us how to be human. In order to develop subjectively as individuals, people need to communicate and interact with other people. The mind, as I said, cannot develop in a vacuum. It needs the feedback and stimulation provided by other minds. In a word, it needs society. You can only be yourself by being with others. The process of teaching a child how to be human is called socialization. Socialization may be defined as the process of bringing an individual into society. It consists of teaching the individual appropriate patterns of thought and behavior by teaching them to follow society's rules. It involves teaching the individual how to talk, think, and act like a human being. Without socialization, we're just another species of ape. Socialization is what turns what anthropologist Desmond Morris called the naked ape into a human being. So what do we teach children in order to socialize them? Primarily, we teach them about norms, values, roles, and statuses, which together make up society's culture. Let me briefly define these terms for you. Norms are social rules that govern behavior. They tell you how to act and how not to act in specific situations. They range from formal laws to common courtesy. In short, norms tell you what society considers to be normal behavior. And you must follow society's norms if you want people to think of you as normal. Values are moral judgments made about behavior. Some acts are considered by society to be good or right, while others are considered to be bad or wrong. Values back up norms. They provide justification or legitimacy for society imposing its norms and rules on the individual. In other words, society doesn't just say, follow these rules because we say so. It says, follow these rules because it is morally the right thing to do. Roles are sets of social expectations about appropriate behavior in particular social situations. Playing a role consists of living up to society's expectations for that role. On the micro level, society is made up of many individuals, all playing interacting roles. Every individual spends their whole life playing a variety of social roles. In modern society, we all play many different roles, such as parent-child, husband-wife, employer-employee, and so on. Statuses are social positions. Every role has a status, and every status has its own rights and its own obligations concerning your behavior and the behavior of others. For example, when I was a prof, I had the right to expect my students to do the coursework, which was their obligation as students. And my students had the right to expect me to do my job properly and teach them sociology, which was my obligation as a prof. These four things then provide order for society. They establish stable behavior patterns, which we can expect people to follow. They make our world predictable. Without them, there would be chaos. Together, these four make up society's culture. A culture is a body of ideas and practices which support each other and which are expected of each other by members of the same group or society. Culture is the subjective side of society. It includes everything meaningful created by society, including language, art, science, politics, and so on. Culture is what we teach our children, which is why socialization is also sometimes referred to as acculturation, which means teaching someone a society's culture. Culture provides a link between society and the individual. As we follow norms, are guided by values, play roles, and acquire statuses, we become part of society. Although culture comes to us from outside ourselves, from society, it has to be internalized by the individual. For example, morality. No one individual established society's morality. Society as a whole determines what is considered right and what is considered wrong. But every individual has to internalize society's morality. Every individual has to make society's morality part of themselves by developing a conscience. You do not just do the right thing because society tells you to do it. You do the right thing because your conscience tells you to do it. So, society invented morality, but that morality becomes part of who you are as an individual. Internalizing society's culture turns each individual into a microcosm or miniature version of society. Each individual's conscience is a microcosm of society's moral structure. Of course, different individuals will have slightly different consciences, but there'll all be variations on a few basic moral guidelines established by society. Because every individual is a member of society, socialization doesn't just teach you about society, it also teaches you about yourself. I would describe the subjective relationship between the individual and society this way. Everyone is born with personality, but without rationality. Every parent quickly learns that every baby is a little bit different. Every baby has its own unique personality from day one. But that's not enough to be a functioning human being. To be human, you also have to be able to think and act rationally, because that's what society expects. And rationality must be learned. Let me put it another way. We're all born as wild animals. And it is the job of society to turn those wild animals into human beings through socialization. Normally, this is primarily the responsibility of each child's parents. Parents have to lead their children, kicking and screaming, down the path of rationality to their humanity. This is why socialization is, to a large extent, just a fancy word for parenting. Parents are normally each person's most important agents of socialization. Now, in a general sense, everyone you meet contributes in some small way to your understanding of humanity and so serves as an agent of socialization for you. But more specifically, sociologists divide up agents of socialization into primary groups and secondary groups. Primary groups are small, intimate groups where everyone knows everyone else personally and interacts on a regular basis. Your main primary groups are normally your family and your friends. Early socialization is mostly done by primary groups because while you're still a young child, your whole world pretty much consists of your family and friends. But when you get older, you have more contact with secondary groups, which are large, formal organizations, such as schools, churches, sports, businesses, and so on. Secondary groups take your socialization to the next level by integrating you into the broader society. They teach you things that your family and friends cannot. They broaden your understanding of both your society and yourself. Now, everyone may be born with a personality, but they're also born in a state of complete ignorance. When we're born, we know absolutely nothing, which includes knowing nothing about ourselves. We are already somebody, but we don't know who we are. We have to learn who we are. We have to learn what we like and what we don't like, what we're good at and what we're not so good at, what we want to do and what we don't want to do, and so on. In other words, we have to develop a self-image. We have to learn to think about ourselves so as to create a sense of self. The self may be defined as an underlying psychological continuity or personality. It consists of long-term patterns of thought and behavior. It's who we are in subjective terms. And the self cannot develop properly in isolation. It can only develop through socialization and interaction with other people. In other words, we can only find out who we are as human beings by interacting with other human beings and learning what it means to be human. The process of socialization and the question of how the individual develops a sense of self was one of the main focuses of early North American sociology. The very first sociology department in North America was established at the University of Chicago in 1892. It attracted a group of theorists who became known as the Chicago School. The Chicago School dominated early North American sociology, and much of its work focused on the subjective side of society, including the development of the self. The Chicago School examined the development of the self in childhood. Charles Horton Cooley, who was associated with the Chicago School, even though he was at Michigan, is best known for developing the concept of the looking glass self. A looking glass is just an old-fashioned term for a mirror. Cooley argued that everybody's born knowing nothing, which includes knowing nothing about ourselves. Children must learn about the world and about themselves. Children quickly realize that adults know much more than they do, so they learn from adults. And when it comes to learning about themselves, children use adults, especially important adults like their parents, as a looking glass or mirror in which to see their own reflection. In other words, the child tries to figure out what the adult thinks of them, and whatever it is, the child tends to believe it. For example, if your parents consistently tell you you're smart, you'll believe you're smart. If they tell you over and over that you're stupid, you'll believe you're stupid. Either way, the self-image which the child creates can become what's termed a self-fulfilling prophecy. A self-fulfilling prophecy is a prophecy that comes true because you made it. If you tell a kid how great they are and they develop a positive self-image, then they'll surely try to accomplish things in life. They probably won't succeed at everything, but they probably will succeed at something. But if you keep telling a kid how dumb they are and they develop a negative self-image, then they won't even try to accomplish anything. So, of course, they won't. Get told that you're a failure often enough, and you will most likely become a failure, because everyone acts on the basis of their self-image, what kind of person they think they are. This is another example of how subjective definitions have objective consequences. How you define people shapes their minds and their lives. Cooley's work on the self was taken up by George Herbert Mead, also of the Chicago School. Mead proposed a more sophisticated model of how the self develops in childhood. First of all, Mead argued that the self is a social structure. The self cannot be created by an individual in isolation. Rather, the self can only arise in a process of interaction between the individual and society. The self is created by society just like any other social structure. Social structures like the family, schools, businesses, and so on, all just consist of specific patterns of thought and behavior. Society teaches people to think a certain way and act a certain way, and those subjective thoughts and objective actions make up all of our social structures. We think and act a certain way with our family, another way at work, and so on. The self, said Mead, is the same thing on a smaller scale. The self consists of a pattern of thought and behavior that remains relatively consistent throughout a person's life, and which is made up of elements taught to that person by society. Mead argued that one of the main things that distinguishes humanity from the animals is that only humans engage in a process of reflection. Only humans think about themselves and reflect on their situation. Animals just act on instinct. In any given situation, they just do what comes naturally. For example, there is the well-known fight or flight instinct. In any kind of confrontation, an animal will consistently either attack or run away, depending on its nature. Now, I have 2 dogs, and I didn't name them Fight and Flight, but I might as well have. Because if I'm taking them for a walk and we encounter a strange dog, the big dog wants to attack, the little dog wants to run away. Now, I've taught them to some extent not to get so excited, but the basic instinct is always the same: fight or flight. Only humans will think about their situation and perhaps learn, modify their behavior. So maybe the first time they'll run away, but the next time they'll bring a weapon and fight, or maybe just take a different route. Mead argued that in order to reflect on ourselves, the subject has to learn to think of him or herself as an object. Everyone has to learn how to, so to speak, step outside themselves and look at themselves from the outside. In other words, from the other person's point of view, from society's point of view. This is why Mead argued that the self has 2 components, which he termed I and me. I, the subject, must learn to think about me, the object. Mead's model is actually a variation on the nature-nurture model. I comes from nature, me comes from nurture or society. Everyone is born as I, a subject, looking out at the world. I am born with certain needs and abilities. I am creative and spontaneous. I just want to do the first thing that pops into my head, just do whatever I feel like. So if I am walking down the street and I see something in a store window that I like, the first thing that I want to do is just smash the window and take what I want. But of course, I have to learn that I can't do that, both because it's wrong and because society will punish me if I do. I have to learn to live by society's rules. And the only way to do that is to internalize society's rules, to make them into your conscience, and thereby make them a part of yourself, a part of who you are, the part Mead called me. I interact with society to create me. I engage in a dialogue with society to create a self-image of me, which then guides my actions for the rest of my life. Life is one long process of balancing what I want from society with what society wants from me. Mead argued that in order for I to learn about me, I must engage in role-taking. Children learn about themselves by playing at or pretending to take on various social roles like train driver, doctor, astronaut, and so on. As they take on these roles, they see whether they enjoy playing them or not, whether they're good at them or not, and whether this is a role they would want to play for real when they grow up. Mead called this a process of anticipatory socialization, because children anticipate playing adult social roles. However, in order to take on various roles, children must have some understanding of how these roles fit together and how they fit into society as a whole. Children must form a model of the society they live in. Mead argued that socialization largely consists of teaching the child society's expectations. Every child must learn that society expects them to behave in a specific way in each situation, and every child must learn to fulfill those expectations. At first, the child learns the expectations of specific important people in their lives, their significant others, especially their parents. The child learns to ask him or herself, what would mommy and daddy want me to do here? But of course, you can't go through your whole life like that. As you grow up, there comes a point when you stop asking yourself what mommy and daddy want and start asking yourself what society wants from you. This is when Mead said that we developed the concept that he called the generalized other, or other people in general, or society. The development of the generalized other is part of the development of the self, because in order to understand yourself, you have to understand your position in society. And in order to understand that, you have to have some model of society. Everyone has to become an amateur sociologist just to function and survive in their society. Since every individual is a member of society, you can't develop a sense of self or individual identity without also developing a social identity, or how you fit into society. You can't understand yourself without understanding your society, at least to some extent. Individual subjectivity, or the self, can only operate in the context of intersubjectivity or culture. Your self-image is intertwined with your image of society. How you see the society you live in shapes the kind of person you become. Mead argued that the self should be seen as a process, not a thing, because your sense of self is not fixed. It changes gradually throughout your whole life. However, Mead said that your basic self-image is formed in childhood, and that it's formed in 3 stages, which he called the preparatory stage, the play stage, and the game stage. The preparatory stage lasts from birth until the infant learns to talk, which is usually around 18 months to 2 years old. Mead also called this the pre-symbolic stage, because it's before the child has learned to communicate using symbols like language. A symbol is simply a thing that stands for another thing, like the words that I'm speaking to you. Symbols have meanings, but infants do not yet understand those meanings, which makes it difficult to communicate with them. Parents are strongly motivated to teach their kids to talk so that they will use their words to communicate instead of just crying and screaming when they want something and driving their parents nuts. Mead argued that even though infants don't understand most of what is going on around them, they already begin to learn in the preparatory stage. They learn at first simply through imitation. Children see adults doing something, so they do it. Now, these days, we quite often tend to look down on imitation. We say things like monkey see, monkey do, as if imitation is something that should be beneath humans. But actually, as Mead pointed out, imitation is the starting point of all learning. For example, the Japanese word for teacher is sensei, which literally translates as someone who's done this before, or more broadly, the voice of experience. People learn primarily by watching and listening to and imitating other people who've done whatever they're trying to learn many times before. And Mead pointed out that infants begin to imitate other people's actions even before they understand what those actions mean. For example, I have two sons, both grown now, but I remember one time when I was sitting on the couch reading the newspaper, and as I finished each section, I just tossed it on the floor. So my older son, Alex, who was about a year old at the time, comes crawling up and he picks up the paper and he's turning the pages and he's turning his head to look at the pages. Only problem is he's holding the paper upside down. Of course, he doesn't know that because he's 1 year old. He can't read. He has no idea why Daddy holds this thing up and turns the pages. But he did it because he saw Daddy doing it. For an infant, that's enough. Once the infant learns to talk, she or he enters the play stage. Being able to talk means that adult and child can engage in true human communication or symbolic interaction. Once parents can talk to their children, they start to have an enormous influence on them. So, this is the stage where Cooley's looking-glass self emerges. The child forms an initial self-image based on what the adults around the child think of them. This self-image gets modified, of course, as time goes on, but it provides a starting point for the development of the self. Mead called it the play stage because this is when children begin to play. However, Mead also noted that at this stage, the way that children play is limited because children's understanding is limited. When children first learn a language, they learn that everything has a label, and they learn the labels. But just learning the labels only gives you a fragmentary understanding. You understand what each piece is, but you don't yet see how all the pieces fit together. It's the difference between words and grammar. When children first start to speak, they know some words, but they don't know how they fit together yet to make proper sentences, so they'll often use a simplified grammar. This limited understanding shapes little kids' actions as well as their words. The play stage is when children begin to play at taking on adult roles. And Mead noted that role-taking is another way that humans distinguish themselves from animals. There are plenty of animals that play when they're young, but only humans play at being someone else. Only humans play roles. However, at first, role-taking is limited by the child's understanding. For example, in the play stage, a child may play at being a train driver, just because it's fun to run around and go woo-woo. It's only later that the child comes to understand the role that trains play in society, transporting people and goods. Similarly, in the play stage, children are limited in terms of what they can play with other children. Mead argued that in the play stage, children learn the physical activities involved in play, things like running, jumping, throwing a ball, catching a ball, and so on. But they cannot yet put those activities together in a structured format with other children. In other words, children learn to play in the play stage, but they can't learn to play games until they reach the game stage. The game stage normally begins about age 8 or 9. In this stage, the child takes role-taking to the next level. In the play stage, the child takes on individual roles. In the game stage, the child can now think about taking on multiple roles simultaneously. And Mead illustrated this with the example of baseball. In the play stage, the child learns to throw a ball, hit a ball, and catch a ball. But they cannot yet play baseball because they haven't yet grasped the concept of teamwork. In a team, each person plays a different role, and for the team to work, each person has to not only understand their role, but also understand how their role relates to all the other roles. For example, every year when kids first begin baseball practice, there's a scene that plays itself out. The coach positions the kids all around the field, and then he hits a high fly ball. And what happens? Every single kid on the field comes crashing together as they all try to catch the ball. After that, the coach explains about teamwork. He explains that each position, each role, has its own responsibilities, and that you have to play your role and let your teammates play their roles. So, like I said, the child has to learn to think about multiple roles simultaneously, not just their role, but the roles of other people. And for me, this doesn't just apply to games. It applies to all social roles. In the game stage, we learn how roles fit together to form society. We learn how things are organized. This is when we form the model of society that Mead called the generalized other. And as our understanding of society improves, so does our understanding of ourselves. As we come to understand how we fit into society, our self-image solidifies. Our sense of self becomes more organized, systematic, and consistent. We become less influenced by other people and stick more to our own views. We learn how to be ourselves while also learning how to work with other people. We learn who we are by playing roles, but we can only play roles by interacting with other people playing their roles. This is why, as I said at the start, for Mead, the self is a social structure, because you can only become yourself by becoming a part of society. Many theorists have built on Mead's work, such as Michael Petroniuk and Clifford Shearing. They developed Mead's model of the self by arguing that the self is not just made up of I and me, as Mead said. They argued that there's also a third component, which they called it. They came to this conclusion by examining situations where neither I nor me is in charge of what the person says or does. For example, stammering or stuttering. The person doesn't want to stutter. Society doesn't want them to stutter. And yet, some people stutter. Petroniuk and Shearing argue that this happens because sometimes it takes over. It is a subconscious part of the self. It's a part that you're not consciously aware of, but that sometimes comes out. Petroniuk and Shearing's three-part model brings us close to a model developed by a much more famous theorist, Sigmund Freud. Freud had basically the same model of the self, except that he put it in Latin: id, ego, superego. Id is Latin for it, ego is Latin for I, and superego is not exactly Latin for me, but it is the same idea. It's the part of you that comes from above you, from society. Freud believed that the id centered on subconscious impulses concerning sex and death, which is a more controversial theory. For Petroniuk and Shearing, the point of bringing it in is to acknowledge that we are never fully in control of ourselves. We learn rationality, but we never become fully rational beings. Sometimes we do irrational things. Sometimes we even do things that are harmful to ourselves, like becoming an alcoholic, doing crystal meth, or even committing suicide. Like the self in general, it is formed as a combination of nature and nurture. If we examine Petroniuk and Shearing's example of stuttering, it's been found that only people with certain genes stutter, but also that only a small minority of people with those genes stutter. The genetic potential to stutter has to be brought out by something social that happens to the person. And that something is normally childhood trauma. Trauma causes psychological damage, which has been termed post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. There are many forms of trauma which can trigger stuttering. Stuttering has been brought on by the child being in a serious car crash, and also by the child's parents getting divorced. These are two very different forms of trauma, but they're both psychologically painful. In recent years, there's been a growing awareness that many children face domestic abuse, which is of course traumatic. There are three main kinds of domestic abuse: physical abuse or beatings, sexual abuse or rape, and psychological or emotional abuse, which primarily consists of belittling the child. The abuser makes the child believe that they deserve the abuse by telling them how clumsy and useless and stupid they are. This brings us back to what I said earlier about creating a negative self-image in the child. Abusers do that to justify their abuse and to minimize the child's opposition. It can make people do things for subconscious reasons, reasons that they're not even consciously aware of. For example, a woman meets a man who's wearing the same brand of aftershave that her stepfather used to wear when he sexually abused her. Her conscious mind doesn't even make the connection, but she's suddenly angry at this man and yells at him over some trivial thing. In extreme cases, trauma can even fracture the child's sense of self. This is what is termed multiple personality disorder, MPD, or dissociative identity disorder, DID. The child creates different selves to play different roles, and so ends up with more than one self or personality in the same body. For example, let's say that hypothetical Mary is being sexually abused by her stepfather. While it's happening, to protect herself psychologically, she closes her eyes and pretends she's somewhere else. This is termed dissociation. Reality is too painful to face, so she pretends she's in a different reality. She doesn't want to play the role of being herself anymore, so she takes on the role of being someone else. She's not Mary, who's being sexually abused. She is, let's call her Jane, who's outside playing with her friends. And because they have very different life experiences, Mary and Jane develop into very different personalities. Mary, who was abused, becomes nervous, shy, and lacking in self-confidence. Jane, who spent her childhood playing with her friends, becomes happy, bright, and outgoing. Sometimes circumstances bring out Mary, sometimes they bring out Jane. But the individual has no control over which one they become unless they get help. It can never be eliminated. It is a permanent part of you. But it can be understood and brought under control. Alcoholics can stop drinking. Drug addicts can stop using. But I would argue that no one can do it on their own. Society created the trauma that underlies all self-destructive behavior, and only society can treat that trauma. We know much more about psychological trauma than we did even 30 or 40 years ago. And there are now therapists who can help. But even with help, it's a difficult journey. Because therapists can only provide signposts. They can tell abuse survivors what to do to get better, but the person still has to do the work themselves. They have to relive the experience in their minds over and over, which is a very painful and difficult thing to do, but which is the only way for them to come to terms with it. This is why abuse survivors normally require regular therapy for about 2 to 3 years before they work through the pain and learn to cope with it, and why some never do. That concludes what I have to say on the development of the individual mind or self. However, the self still plays a role when we go to the Meso level and look at how individuals interact. Irving Goffman, a Canadian-born member of the Second Chicago School, argued that the self is not just a part of the individual, but that the self is created in a process of interaction between the individual and society, or as Goffman put it, between actor and audience. Goffman argued that people play social roles in much the same way that actors play roles on a stage. He developed an approach he called dramaturgical theory, which says that life is like a drama, or that society is like an interactive theatre, and social roles are like theatrical roles. Basically, he expanded on Shakespeare's famous line from The Tempest, "All the world's a stage, and we are but players on it," said the playwright. We spend our whole life playing roles, just like actors on a stage. When an actor plays a role, they have to create a persona or self-image, which they present to their audience. Similarly, as we play social roles, we engage in a process that Goffman called presentation of self. We create a self-image which we present to our audience, to the people we're interacting with. As we do this, we engage in a process of impression management. We try to manage the impression we make on others so as to create a good impression. Goffman argued that we don't do this just because we want other people to like us. More importantly, we do it because we want other people to believe that we know how to play our roles. We want others to think that we are competent, that we're good at our roles, that we can play them in the correct, socially acceptable manner. We want this because we can only play our roles if other people accept us in those roles. All social roles are interactive. Whatever role you play, other people have to accept you and cooperate with you to enable you to play that role. So Goffman argued that we all have to put some work into managing the impression we make on others. Obviously, we prepare for our roles and we try to avoid making any mistakes. But we also do more than that. We control our facial expression and tone of voice so that we appear calm and in control rather than emotional and out of control. We also select teammates or make friends with whom we interact well and who can help us play our roles. And perhaps most importantly, we try to promote a sense of in-group loyalty in the audience. In other words, we try to get other people on our side, try to get them to accept us as one of them, so they'll overlook any minor mistakes we make and sometimes even help us to play our role. And usually, people will do this. Not so much because they're being nice, but because if there is any disruption in role-playing, it's embarrassing. Not just for the person who screwed up, but for everyone involved. Essentially, most people have a vested interest in trying to make society run as smoothly as possible with as little disruption as possible. However, said Goffman, sometimes the disruption is too big to ignore. This can happen in several ways. First of all, because modern society has grown very complex and we all play many different roles, some of them have contradictory expectations. Goffman argued that when you first start to play a role, such as on your first day of school or your first day in a new job, at first you feel like you're acting, like you're pretending to play the role. Over time, with repetition, you get more involved in the role, and it becomes a part of yourself. However, because we play so many different roles, we always have to maintain a role distance or detachment from any single role. And this is because different roles require different self-images. Different roles have different audiences, and different audiences have different expectations of you. In order to live up to everybody's expectations, you have to create different self-images for different social contexts. So, for example, when you're with your boss playing the role of employee, it's, "Yes, sir, whatever you want, sir, I'm ready to go, sir." But when the boss isn't there and you're with the other employees playing the role of co-worker, it's, "Oh, that slave driver, this place is such a dump. I wish I could get a better job." Because that's what's expected of you. Now, this works as long as you can maintain what Goffman calls audience segregation, meaning keeping your different audiences apart. But if your audiences get together, compare notes, and figure out that you've been presenting different self-images to them, then there's disruption and you're in trouble. In recent years, the media have made it increasingly difficult for public figures to maintain audience segregation. For example, politicians traditionally tell everyone what they want to hear. They'll promise one thing to one group and promise the exact opposite to another group. But these days, the media publicize these inconsistencies. And after a while, everyone stops believing that person, and it becomes impossible for them to continue playing the role of politician. This is why, these days, politicians are increasingly reluctant to tell the public what they actually stand for. Instead, they just smile at the camera and say, "Vote for me because I'm a nice guy." The media have also made it increasingly difficult for public figures to maintain a separation between their roles front stage and backstage. Goffman argued that, just like in the theatre, every social role has to have a front stage, where the actor plays their role, and a backstage, where the actor relaxes, rehearses, and prepares to go on stage. For example, right now I am on stage, but when I turn off the camera, my office becomes my backstage, where I do my research, write my notes, and prepare my talks. Normally, actors try to keep audiences out of their backstage, their private lives, because if they see in, it may disrupt the impression that they're trying to make when they go on stage. If people don't like what they see backstage, they'll no longer accept that person on stage, and then they'll be unable to play their role. But the media these days loves to expose scandals and drag public figures' private lives into public view. So in recent years, we've seen a number of public figures unable to continue in their roles due to media exposure, such as Bill Clinton and Bill Cosby in the US, and Rob Ford and John Ghomeshi in Canada. Only Donald Trump miraculously rises above scandal after scandal, the exception that proves the rule, as it were. Disruption also occurs when a gap appears between a person's actual social identity and their virtual social identity. In other words, between who they are and who they're supposed to be. This happens because sometimes people pretend to be someone they're not and get found out. Now, sometimes a person does this because he's a con man who wants to take advantage of other people, so he lies to them. But more often, says Goffman, people do it in self-defense, so as to avoid stigma. Goffman defines stigma as a socially undesirable characteristic attributed to a person or group. And since society decides what is socially undesirable, just about anyone can potentially be stigmatized. You can be stigmatized for being the wrong skin color, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or for being too tall or too short, too fat or too thin, or for smoking, gambling, doing drugs, or whatever society decides on. Being stigmatized has negative consequences. People refuse to accept you in certain roles, so that, for example, it can be difficult to get a good job. Because of this, some people try to hide their stigma, as when a gay person pretends to be straight, or a partially colored person pretends to be white. If the truth comes out, their public image is disrupted. They lose their social standing, maybe even their jobs. Stigma is another example of my modified Thomas theorem. Subjective definitions have objective consequences. How people subjectively define you has objective consequences for your life. Goffman's argument that we present different self-images to different audiences led critics like Philip Manning to charge that Goffman viewed the underlying self as very cynical and manipulative. Goffman replied that no, the problem is that modern society has so many roles that it forces us to sometimes be inconsistent and even untruthful. But over time, Goffman decided that he had overestimated the degree to which role-playing is performed creatively by the actor in negotiation with the audience, and that in practice, role-playing mostly just consisted of following established social rules, routines, and rituals. Like Talk at Parsons, Goffman started out with a focus on individual actions and decisions, but ended up focusing more on social structures and rules. In the 80s, Arlie Hochschild expanded on Goffman's work by helping to found the Sociology of Emotion. She argued that part of the process of impression management is emotion management. As we play social roles, we have to follow what she called feeling rules, which are rules about what emotion we're supposed to be feeling in any social situation. To interact properly and play our roles properly, we don't just have to act right and talk right, we also have to feel right. We have to feel the appropriate emotion for that situation. Or at least we have to look like we feel the appropriate emotion. Hochschild distinguishes between surface acting and deep acting. Surface acting is when you fake an emotion, so it's only on the surface, such as a politician smiling as he kisses babies, even though he really hates the snot-nosed little brats. Deep acting is when you really do feel the emotion, but you've done what Hochschild calls emotion work to create that emotion. Emotion work is usually unconscious. This is one thing subjectivists do. They try to bring out the things that our minds do every day that we're not even consciously aware of. Hochschild said that there are two kinds of emotion work. There is suppression of inappropriate emotions, such as not laughing at a funeral. And there is evocation of appropriate emotions, such as when you hear that the relative of a friend has died, and at first you're not sad, so you think about how you felt when some relative of yours died, or maybe when your dog died, and that makes you appropriately sad to play the role of consoling friend. Mostly, we do this unconsciously, but sometimes we also do it consciously. So, is emotion management manipulative? Yes, but we are also manipulating ourselves emotionally to fit into the roles that we play. Hochschild also argued that in capitalism, just like everything else, emotion is for sale. The West is seeing less and less jobs in manufacturing as factories get automated, and more jobs in the service sector, meaning doing things for people, such as fast food server, hairdresser, doctor, nurse, or Hochschild's focus, which was on airline stewardesses. Every job that involves social interaction has some degree of emotional labor, which is where you smile and pretend that you feel great and act sympathetic so as to make your clients feel better. Hochschild estimates that women do about twice as much emotional labor as men. And she also argues that when Western women hire third world nannies to look after their children, they are outsourcing their emotional labor or care work. She argues that Western capitalism has evolved from exploiting the third world's natural resources to also exploiting its emotional resources. This argument connects the subjective and objective sides of society, and it also connects the micro and macro levels of society. Goffman's work has been criticized for just focusing on the micro and meso levels of individuals and interaction, but here Hochschild fits his work into the macro structures of capitalist society. And so we move on now to examine subjectivity at the macro level. At the macro level, subjectivism's main focus is on meaning. And the central issue is, how does society create meanings? And the main answer is, through rationality. Rational thought establishes meanings and definitions which can be accepted by society as a whole. Rationality is experienced by the individual mind, but it is created by society. No individual could have invented rationality. It was invented by tribal societies to help them survive. Individual rationality can only be created and maintained in a context of intersubjectivity or shared rationality. Rationality orders thought. Rationality allows people to communicate and to cooperate, and those are the twin foundations of society. Society does not create subjectivity, but it does order it. As I said before, human beings are born with personality, but without rationality. From the moment you're born, you are somebody, but at first, that somebody is basically a wild animal. Other people, usually parents, have to drag their children, kicking and screaming, down the path of socialization to rationality. They have to do this because society expects every individual to acquire rationality and to think and act rationally so as not to disrupt the running of society. Rationality is what allows each individual to fit in to society. Rationality is invented by society, but it's used by individuals to guide their actions. Society expects individuals to act rationally. Moreover, rationality has always been closely tied to self-interest. It is rational to act in your own best interests. So, society expects individuals to act guided by what's termed their rational self-interest. This is in practice a cost-benefit model of rationality. The theory that rational behavior consists of acting in your self-interest by maximizing your pleasure or benefits and minimizing your pain or costs goes back to Epicureanism in ancient Greece, was revived as utilitarianism by the Scottish philosophers Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, and John Stuart Mill in the 18th and 19th centuries, and appears in sociology in the exchange theory tradition pioneered by George Homans and Peter Blau in the 1960s. However, society changes over time, and society's ideas about rationality and rational self-interest change over time. Different societies think that different things are rational, and the same society may think different things are rational at different historical periods. Max Weber and the Frankfurt School, among others, have argued that different kinds of rationality have existed in the course of history. And as rationality has changed, rational self-interest has also changed, as I shall now briefly recount. Early tribal societies saw the world in spiritual or subjective terms, so that's how they defined self-interest. They could not emphasize material possessions because they were nomadic. They followed their food supply, like Plains Indians following the buffalo. This meant that periodically, everybody had to pack up all their possessions and carry them on their back when they moved camp. Back then, they didn't even have pack animals. They had to carry everything. And stuff is heavy to carry. So, they didn't want to maximize their possessions. They wanted to minimize them. They kept the bare essentials: tools, weapons, clothes, food. The idea that self-interest consists of wanting to accumulate more and more possessions, which is largely how we define it today, literally would never even have occurred to these people. Instead, what was seen as being in your self-interest was that your spirit was in balance or harmony. Your spirit must be in balance with your body, with nature, with other spirits, and with other people. In practice, this primarily meant maintaining good, loving relationships with your fellow band members because they were your family. The band kept you alive objectively, but beyond that, it provided subjective benefits in the form of the love of a whole community. The rise of agriculture led to permanent settlements which allowed wealth to be accumulated. And so self-interest was gradually redefined in more objective terms as being about accumulating money and possessions. This put organized religions into a self-contradictory situation. On the one hand, religion is about the spirit world and preaches that what matters is doing good and being kind to others so that your soul will be saved. But on the other hand, from the very beginnings of agricultural society, the priesthood formed an alliance with the aristocracy and became part of the ruling class. The priests said that what mattered was morality, but people could see that what really mattered to the priests was wealth and power. For example, in 16th century Germany, Martin Luther founded Protestantism by protesting against the ever-growing wealth and power of the Catholic Church. He said that Jesus Christ lived a life of simplicity, poverty, and service to others, and that the Catholic Church had fallen away from the path of Christ. This is why Protestant churches did not have decorations of gold and jewels the way Catholic churches did. I would argue that the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church was just one aspect of the broader confusion in European society at the time as to whether self-interest should be defined in primarily subjective or objective terms. The coming of industrial capitalism settled the matter. Science shifted society's focus from the subjective to the objective world, and industry provided lots of new objective products to buy. Money became the new god, and consumerism became the new religion. Cash value replaced spiritual values as the most important thing in life. Self-interest was redefined in economic terms, not spiritual terms, in objective terms, not subjective terms. Of course, subjective benefits like love still matter, but in capitalism, they come a distant second to making money and accumulating possessions. Capitalism has also redefined self-interest in individual terms, not collective terms. In the tribe, there was very little difference between individual interests and group interests because everybody did everything together. The men hunted together, the women gathered together, everybody ate together. Every individual depended for their survival on the tribe, so every individual put the survival of the tribe first. You looked after other people because they looked after you. But in capitalism, every individual has to make their own career. The economic structure of capitalism individualizes our lives and so individualizes our self-interest. Capitalism introduces a social gap between individual interests and collective interests. We still have collective interests, but it's more difficult to see where they lie. This in turn has made it easier for people to be deceived about where their best interests lie. This deceit can be accomplished through various social structures, the media, schools, churches, political parties, and so on. I would argue that the ultimate example of this deceit is suicide bombers. Groups, whether impelled by political or religious ideologies, can convince some individuals that it is in the group's collective interest that they redefine their individual self-interest so as to blow themselves to pieces. This demonstrates the limitations of the self-interest model of rationality. If blowing yourself up can be considered a rational act, then so can literally any behavior, no matter how destructive or self-destructive. I would therefore argue that while rationality is partly based on self-interest, it needs to be understood in broader terms. Historically, I would argue that rationality has evolved in distinct stages which can be identified. Karl Marx categorized societies in terms of their objective mode of production, or how their economy works. I would argue that you can also categorize societies in terms of their subjective mode of rationality. A mode of rationality is a worldview or a holistic way of understanding the world, including both nature and society. And I would argue that in the course of history, there have been just 5 distinct modes of rationality. They are spiritualism, which is also sometimes called animism, magic, myth, religion, and science. I'm going to briefly examine each of these now, locating them in their social contexts. Humanity's first mode of rationality was that of early tribal societies. It's been called spiritualism because they believed that everything has a spirit. Just as humans have an objective body and a subjective mind or spirit, they believed that everything in nature did. This worldview has also been called animism because they believed that everything is alive. They didn't distinguish between animate and inanimate, living and non-living, like animals versus rocks. For them, everything was alive, and so everything had a spirit. The spirit of the wolf, the eagle, the winds, the water, and so on. And just as with humans, the spirit decides what the body will do. So, for example, the sun rises because the sun wants to rise. If someday the sun decided not to rise, it wouldn't. This mode of rationality explains the world in subjective terms. It personifies nature. Things happen because of the personal, subjective decisions of spirits, both human and nature spirits, not because of the impersonal forces and laws that modern science has identified. This is the mode of rationality of people who lived in close daily contact with nature and with each other. In the tribe, every individual was a part of society, and every society or tribe was a part of the ecology. There was no division between society and nature as there is today when most of us live in cities. This is why they believed that nature was just like humanity, with a body and a spirit. This is also the mode of rationality of a society with enormous respect for nature. It's the mode of rationality of a society which was well aware that nature contained forces that were far more powerful than humans. Thunderstorms, earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, wild animals, and so on. These forces must have had spirits, which were also far more powerful than human spirits. Over time, a hierarchy of spirits emerged, ranking spirits from least powerful to most powerful. At the top, there was usually a single great spirit, which was eventually called God. In order to survive, early societies had to fit into their ecology. In spiritual terms, this meant understanding what the spirits wanted people to do, how the spirits wanted people to behave. In order to learn the will of the spirits, the tribe created specialized social positions: the shaman or witch doctor and the medicine woman. The shaman did male jobs like leading the young men of the tribe in rituals and prayers to ask the spirits for success in the hunt or in warfare. The medicine woman did female jobs like assisting with childbirth and making herbal medicines from herbs which were seen as gifts of the goddess or Mother Nature. By divining the will of the nature spirits, they made sure that the tribe did not upset the balance of nature, but instead fit into nature, or the ecology. However, over time, the human population grew and humanity grew bolder. We decided that we would not just ask the spirits to do what we wanted through prayer, we'd force them to do what we wanted. We'd do this through magic. Magic is supernatural because magic is based on something that doesn't exist in nature: the symbol. A symbol is just a thing that stands for another thing. But symbols are a human invention. No wild animal makes symbols. As something above nature, symbols were from the very start thought to have power. And indeed, they do. We use symbols like language to accumulate knowledge, which allows us to make technology, which gives us power over nature. However, tribal societies thought they could use symbols directly to give them power over the spirit world. So they developed what's been termed symbolic magic or sympathetic magic. The idea behind this was that a symbolic representation of something could capture part of the spirit of that thing. Doing something to the symbol would then have an effect on that thing's whole spirit, and so also its body. The most well-known example of early magic is cave paintings. These were not done for decoration. We know this because they were never painted in the tribe's main living area, but always in a smaller cave off to the side, a special area reserved for magical rituals. The shaman would paint pictures of the animals they were about to hunt or the other tribe they were about to fight. He'd then paint his tribe's spears and arrows flying at and striking the other side. We've also found marks where the young men of the tribe would physically stab the painting with their spears. Now, we're pretty sure that this was not an early form of art criticism. Rather, the goal was to weaken the spirit, and so also the body, of the other side, and so bring our side success in the hunt or the battle. And the thing is, magic works as long as you believe in it. Why? Because subjective definitions have objective consequences. If you define yourself as a winner, if you believe that you can't lose because the spirits are on your side, then you'll fight like a winner, and most likely you will win. Any coach will tell you that confidence is essential to victory. If magic gives you that confidence, then it works. Moreover, magic rituals do not just give that subjective boost to individuals. They also work on a group or social level. Because going through a collective ritual together strengthens group solidarity. It creates a collective feeling that the group now has a special spiritual bond formed by sharing in the ritual. And the more united the group feels, the more they will fight as one, the better they will work together, and so the more likely they are to be successful. It was many thousands of years before cave paintings evolved into written language. In the interim, knowledge was transmitted from generation to generation through stories or oral history. These stories were important because they were the tribe's memory, and they shaped the tribe's identity. But to be remembered, they had to be told in a memorable fashion. Nobody's going to remember a boring story. So, the stories would be about key events in the tribe's history, but they'd be spiced up, made more dramatic, just like Hollywood does with real-life stories today. What mattered was capturing the spirit of events, not getting the factual details right. And so these stories became myths. Myths intertwine historical facts with social values, and so intertwine the natural world with the spirit world. Myths are morality tales, used particularly to socialize children, teaching them the importance of things like morality, courage, persistence, respect, and so on. Bible stories are examples of later morality tales. There's a clear moral to each story. Strengthening social values unified and strengthened the tribe, thereby promoting the survival of the tribe. Myths taught respect for powerful spirits or gods, but myths also taught that people could do remarkable things if they set their minds to it. Myths were often about tribal heroes. These were most commonly war chiefs who'd led their tribe to victory in battle. With retelling, their feats became exaggerated until they were superhuman, and as tribes grew into nations, their heroes became early superheroes with super strength, like Hercules and Samson, or superintelligence or genius, like Odysseus and Solomon. Those two were the original superhero archetypes, the strong man and the wise man. I shall have more to say about them in later talks. The invention of agriculture increased the food supply and so increased the population. Small tribes grew into large nations. As they did so, they had to invent the first large-scale, formalized social structures, such as the army, the state, and the church. In spiritual terms, the solitary figures of the shaman and medicine woman gave way to large, organized priesthoods. These priests turned mythology into religion. Myths were part of society's collective identity. So as society became larger and more powerful, the spirits it believed in had to also become larger and more powerful. Nature spirits became gods, who were eventually amalgamated into a single, all-powerful God. Religion takes the subjective model of the world as far as it can go. Thousands of small local nature spirits have evolved into a single supreme being. Everything that happens is ultimately the will of this supreme being, God's will. Religion is the natural worldview or mode of rationality of agricultural society. The world over, farming societies are the most religious societies. However, the rise of agriculture led to a dramatic increase in social inequality. The tribe was basically a family where everything was shared equally. But agricultural nations saw the rise of a ruling class, the aristocracy. The aristocracy ruled primarily by force of arms. The leader of the army became the leader of society because anyone who said otherwise would get his head chopped off. However, while force works in the short term, long-term rule requires legitimation. For people to accept your rule, there must be some moral or socially acceptable reason for it, not just brute force. This is why the aristocracy very quickly formed an alliance with the priesthood. In return for a privileged position in society, the priests told the people to obey their kings because that was the will of the gods. Also, as pictures evolved into written words, the priests were the ones who invented writing, and they kept the secret of literacy to themselves. This meant that only they had access to written knowledge, which made them learned and respected and listened to. Only the priests knew the will of the gods, and that gave them power. Only the priests had the power of the symbol. Over time, divine legitimation went through a process of inflation. First, the priests told the people that the king ruled because he'd been hand-picked by the gods to rule over them. Then, that he was an avatar or representative of a god. Then, that he was the son of a god. And finally, that he was a god. For example, the later Egyptian pharaohs were worshipped as living gods in the institution of divine monarchy. In Europe, Christianity could not tell the people that their kings were gods because Christianity says that there is only one God. But Christianity could still support the monarchy and the aristocracy in a variety of ways. First, the Catholic Church proclaimed the divine right of kings, which stated that kings had been handpicked by God and so ruled by divine right. And second, much more broadly, the Church presented an extremely hierarchical and also sexist model of the spirit world. The afterlife is supposedly divided up into heaven, purgatory, and hell, which means that souls are effectively divided up into upper class, middle class, and lower class. There's only one God, and yet God is also divided up into a similar hierarchy. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. The father-son relationship is innately hierarchical, but there is no God the Mother. The Goddess has been replaced by the gender-neutral Holy Spirit, showing the decline in women's social position in agricultural society. Below God, the spirits are also arranged hierarchically. Archangels, angels, cherubim, seraphim, and so on. Below the spirits, human souls are also arranged hierarchically. Apostles, saints, the saved, the lost in purgatory, and the damned in hell. And the Catholic Church has a hierarchical and sexist structure. The Pope is God's representative on earth. Beneath him are the cardinals, archbishops, bishops, abbots, priors, priests, and at the very bottom, the women, the nuns. Well, if the spirit world is hierarchical and the church is hierarchical, then clearly God wants society to be hierarchical. And so Christianity provided religious legitimation for the hierarchical social structure of feudalism and its ruling class. Emperors, kings, princes, lords, dukes, earls, viscounts, and at the very bottom, the peasants. While parish priests were drawn from the common people, the upper ranks of the church were drawn from the aristocracy. So, church and aristocracy had strong family ties, and so they naturally supported each other. They became the two wings of the feudal ruling class, and they ruled Europe together. This also meant, however, that they declined together when agricultural society declined. Industrial society has replaced aristocracy and priests with capitalists and scientists. Max Weber gathered evidence that religion has provided legitimation for the ruling classes of agricultural societies. However, he also argued that rationality in general and religion in particular have gone through a process of growing rationalization in the course of history. Weber said that in tribal society there were thousands of little nature spirits, with every tribe having its own spirits. And he said that this was chaotic. When tribes amalgamated into nations with the rise of agriculture, religions arose which put these spirits together into pantheons. So, early religions proposed polytheism, a belief in many gods. These religions imposed some order on the spirit world, but with so many spirits, they were inevitably full of contradictions and inconsistencies. So, over time, polytheism evolved into monotheism, belief in just one God. Weber argued that monotheism resolves the inconsistencies of polytheism and provides a clearer focus for religious belief, and so it is a more rational form of religion. In Europe, Catholicism then evolved into Protestantism, which Weber argued is the most rational religion because it promoted the Protestant work ethic, which says that God wants everyone to work hard. Weber argued that this work ethic provided the spirit or motivation of early capitalism. He said Protestantism channeled religious fervor into the economy, turning business into a holy calling. He said that this industrious attitude provided the subjective motivation behind the Industrial Revolution and eventually led to the rise of science, which is the next step in the evolution of rationality. Now, there is evidence that many early businessmen were Protestants, but not so much for early scientists and inventors. Indeed, Francis Yates has argued that the transition from religion to science was actually accomplished through a temporary return to magic. Protestantism began in the 16th century, but modern science began with the Renaissance in the 14th century. Yates has found that many Renaissance scholars were fascinated by the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, which means Hermes the thrice mighty. This was supposedly an ancient Egyptian priest who had collected the magical knowledge of the ancients. Well, modern research has shown that the writings were actually put together in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD and consisted of a mishmash of ancient Greek and Roman myths and legends. But what matters is that interest in Hermes Trismegistus revived the belief that the objective world could be manipulated using symbols or talismans. Hermes Trismegistus updated the ancient figure of the shaman into the modern figure of the magus, the magician, who's a man of knowledge and so also a man of power. Yeats has argued that religion promotes a passive attitude of acceptance of God's will, but science requires an active attitude, wanting to learn about nature and take control of nature. Yeats argued that magic provided the bridge here. It was spiritual, like religion, but active, like science. Magic gave European intellectuals a new will towards the world, a new desire to transform the world. I would expand on Yeats's model, and I would argue that modes of rationality are cyclical in terms of promoting passive or in terms of promoting passive or active attitudes, swinging back and forth like a pendulum. Spiritualism is passive and emphasizes fitting in to nature. Magic is active, seeking to impose our will on the spirits through man-made symbols. And mythology took this to the next level as tribes grew into nations, creating ancient superheroes with superpowers like Hercules, who symbolized the military might of ancient Greece. Then religion is once more passive, emphasizing obedience to God, church, and king. And science is active, seeking to transform nature through technology and industry. Paul Feyerabend has pointed out that when an old worldview or mode of rationality starts to crumble, it's impossible to know right away what will replace it. Society as a whole becomes uncertain as to just what is rational and what is irrational. So, when European intellectuals began to challenge the rule of religion, magic seemed just as rational to them as science. Accepting either one required a leap of faith, a leap in the dark to something new and not really understood. Many early scientists conducted both scientific experiments and magical experiments without really distinguishing between them, because to them it was all just alternative knowledge relative to the official church orthodoxy that they were fighting to move beyond. Gradually, knowledge which started as magical became scientific. Alchemy became chemistry. Astrology became astronomy. Numerology became mathematics. And the rules of magic became the laws of nature. Just as religion is the natural mode of rationality of agricultural society, so science is the natural mode of rationality of industrial society. As the world, beginning in the West, has gone through a process of industrialization, it has also gone through a process of secularization. Belief in religion is slowly giving way to belief in science. In rural regions, religion remains strong, but in the growing urban centers, science holds sway. The spiritual worldview is declining. However, as the Frankfurt School pointed out, the Enlightenment of the early 18th century turned science away from its early, free-thinking, semi-magical tradition and towards serving the needs of business. Rationality, which was originally about fitting into and respecting nature, became about dominating and exploiting nature. It became technocratic rationality, the rationality of industrial society. Science claims to be the very embodiment of rationality. And I would agree with Weber that science is more rational than previous modes of rationality. But that does not mean that science is perfectly rational. As the Frankfurt School has pointed out, science provides ideological support for the capitalist ruling class, just as religion did for the aristocracy. Science claims to be value-free, but in practice it embodies the values of capitalism, domination and exploitation. And science has its pros and its cons. Science and the industrial technology it creates have unquestionably brought us many wonderful products. But industry has brought with it industrial warfare and industrial pollution, among other problems. If industrial society renders our planet uninhabitable, as it can now do in at least half a dozen different ways, then science will not appear to be so rational after all. The main difference between science and all previous modes of rationality is that they all explain the world in terms of the subjective decisions of spirits, while science explains the world in terms of objective forces and causes. This shift in focus from the subjective to the objective also involved a similar shift in social values and in how people defined themselves and society. The subjective became less important, the objective became more important. More precisely, social relations became less important, while accumulating possessions and money became more important. Science and industry created new products, and capitalism told us to buy those products. While love and friendship still matter on the micro scale, in macro terms, money makes the world go round. Profits come before people in capitalism. This brief history of modes of rationality has shown that meanings and ideas of rationality change over time as society changes. Most of the time, these changes are small and gradual, but every once in a long time, society changes its mode of rationality. It redefines its basic assumptions about rationality. Feyerabend has argued that different modes of rationality or worldviews are incommensurable or incomparable because they define the world in completely different terms. For example, religion defines it in terms of the will of God, while science defines it in terms of the laws of nature. I would agree with Feyerabend up to a point. But I would argue that there is one thing that ties all modes of rationality together, and that is practice. Rationality does not just order our subjective world. It also orders the relationship between the subjective world and the objective world. Reason must guide practice. Reason must work in practical terms for humanity to survive. Rationality is not just a self-contained subjective world. Humanity did not develop rationality and meaningful language just so we could sit around the campfire and swap stories. We developed rationality to help us survive by working together in our mutual self-interest. But we can only do that if rationality provides a workable model of the world around us. Now, that model does not have to be scientific. As we saw when we looked at the work of Marvin Harris, the Hindu sacred cow and the Jewish pork taboo provide religious reasons for fitting into the local ecology. What matters is not what people think, but what they do. Different modes of rationality can provide different explanations and different motivations, but they all have to work in practice in the same world. And for that reason, they are all, to some extent, comparable. In practical terms, science allows us to do much more than any previous mode of rationality. That, I would argue, is primarily what makes it more rational than any previous mode of rationality. However, adopting a new mode of rationality does not mean that we should just throw out all previous modes of rationality. Modes of rationality are a series of models or approximations to reality. Each has its pros and its cons. None of them is perfect, but each of them has something to teach us. Science has allowed us to understand both nature and society much better than ever before, and yet, paradoxically, science has lost the respect for both nature and other people that were taught by earlier modes of rationality. When indigenous peoples oppose pipelines and similar projects on spiritual grounds, they are expressing an ecological understanding and respect that industrial capitalism has lost, and that I would argue it desperately needs to regain. Above all, we need to regain tribal societies' focus on balance. Like them, we need to fit into the balance of nature, not dominate and exploit nature. And we need a more balanced, egalitarian society, one not based on domination and exploitation of other people. But to do that, we need to arrive at a more balanced understanding of our own self-interest. We need to balance individual interests and collective interests, short-term interests and long-term interests, objective interests and subjective interests. I would argue that science may be the best mode of rationality we've come up with so far, but that it is not the last word in the evolution of human rationality. On the contrary, I would argue that we still need to get a lot more rational before we destroy our planet and ourselves. That concludes what I have to say on issues in subjectivism. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day, all.